Welcome to A to Z Running, where we help runners thrive. I'm Zach, and up next, we discuss mismatch theory and how to grapple with expectations versus perceptions of effort. And after that, World of Running updates about records at Valencia Half, how to make your own gels, and more. So glad to have you back with us. Hey, remember that next week is our end of month Q&A episode. And if you've got a burning question on your mind about running, training, racing, running related things, and all of the other kinds of stuffs, and you want to share that question with us, depending on how long it will take to answer the question, we may still fit it in next week. We may fit it in the next month, but we do it at the end of every month. And we would love to hear and have your questions. Submit a question at AtoZrunning.com/question. And you can do that anytime, all the time, as many as you want. Doesn't mean we'll answer your question every single time, but ask away. And if you've asked before, ask again. No problems. All right, so now a quick shout out, because we always enjoy, as we say so much on here, that we really enjoy talking with all of you. Part of why we do the Q&A episode, but also just like, being on the running scene at the events and stuff and running into people out and about. And this happened yet again recently. I ran into one of you, so a shout out to Eric, and appreciated just a chance to hear from a listener who said, oh yeah, I've been listening and I appreciate some of the things that have been on the show and some of the guests or topics or otherwise. So share with us if there's things that you've enjoyed or things that you'd like to hear more of or less. Maybe send the ones you want to hear less of to Andy so that you don't get some kind of snarky response from Zach. We'll see about that. But anyway, we always appreciate the interactions, and those are good things. Cool stuff. Well, I wanted to mention once more that we do have the A to Z Running shop with the gear open, and what we've got on there, we've got these lightweight hoodies, which is what I'm wearing right now. If you're not listening, or if you're not watching, if you're only listening, you won't see obviously my clothes. And so I'm wearing the hooded version, and it's like a lightweight running, like athletic hoodie. It's pretty awesome. We've got a half zip on there. We've got t-shirts as well, and hats and visors. So any of those kinds of things, all in the sweet A to Z Running black and blue branded, and we would love to share those with you. So if you would like something from the shop, just go to AtoZrunning.com/shop, or just look for the word shop in the corner somewhere on the site. Now, I wanted to mention here quickly before we get on to the main part of the program, a quick reflection, because it's very relevant both to the conversation, the discussion about effort on the episode here today, but also more in general as we talk about these kinds of things with so many of you so often. So I was on a training run not terribly long ago, about a week or so ago, depending on when you're listening to this. And it was more or less my last major long hard effort before a marathon that I'm running soon. And so, as these things go, training had been going very well up until that moment. Just very smooth, minimal disruptions, the small stuff here and there, like getting sick now and again, all that kind of stuff, but minimal disruptions. And so I go on this training run, and it's supposed to just be a long, strong effort. And the operative thing here is I want it to be comfortably strong the entire time, not overdoing anything, not straining. And I get out on the run, and I start noticing some discomfort in my shin early on, like a mile or so into the run. It was very early on. And naturally, as many of us like to do in these moments, my first thought was, it'll pass. It's just a little bit of tightness in my shin or something like that. I think I actually even stopped briefly and just kind of like put a finger on it and rubbed that a moment just to see, where is this coming from? It was clearly soft tissue. It wasn't like my bone was aching or something. Clearly just some tightness in my shin right above my ankle. So this is something that I've experienced before, as many of us like to do in these moments. I thought, well, this happens now and again. Shin muscles are tight. I can loosen it up afterward, make sure I take good care of it the next few days. I'll be fine. So I continue on with the effort. And keep in mind, I'm supposed to be running about 21 miles at a steady-ish, tempo-ish effort. Okay, so I'm about a mile in, and I'm noticing this tightness. A few miles later, and it's not really changed. It's come and gone in degrees of severity, but it's basically been there the whole time. And I start to kind of wonder, maybe this would be just a good time to just kind of call it and not really push the envelope. I could try jogging for a bit and just see how it feels and then just finish easy, or I could just head straight back and be done. Those are my kinds of options. Now, in the back of my head, You know what's going on in the back of my head. I'm saying to myself, this run is a really important workout, which is never true, by the way. There's no such thing as one workout that is like super important by itself. Okay, so I'm saying that to myself. I'm immediately beginning to tell myself the lie that we should not tell. And so then, and then I create a greater sense of importance on completing the workout, despite how I'm feeling, than there really truly is. Because there's absolutely no importance, as we all know, there's no importance in finishing a workout that leaves me hurt versus just not doing the workout and, being healthy to go again tomorrow kind of thing. So how do you think it ended? Any guesses? It ended as badly as it could. I finished the run, having run the entire 21 miles at a strong, steady effort, knowing the entire time that I just wasn't feeling great, but it was not so much so that it was like I was limping on the run. But I got done, and I can't. It was like 10 minutes later. I couldn't even walk hardly. Couldn't really flex my foot without crazy amounts of pain in my shin. And so immediately I just knew that I had done the wrong thing. And now, at the moment of recording this, I don't know exactly when you're listening to this, but at the moment of recording this, I'm over a week later, and I have not yet been able to run a step still. And I've got to run a marathon in 2 weeks, under 2 weeks now. And so that begs that question. Why would I ever find it worthwhile to jeopardize my season trajectory, my season goal, over a single training run of minimal importance? Okay, that's the first reflection. And then the second layer of it is, well, now that it's happened, because it has, so then what do we do in these moments? Despair is an easy thing to experience at these times. Disappointment, certainly, frustration and all. And my immediate reaction, and this is my only effort to kind of like salvage the bad choices I was making in the run, there's really nothing you can do when the disruption is there and it's imminent or happening. Is it imminent? Imminent? When it's happening currently, I can't do anything about that now. I can't take back the time that I've lost in terms of the routine and rhythm of the training that's been disrupted. But what I can do is just do anything possible to be as good as I can and as healthy rather as I can, as immediately as I can without jeopardizing anything. So I could rush back into it right now, which would, potentially further jeopardize the possibility of coming back, or I can just simply take whatever today has. And you know what? It may well be that this marathon that I have been planning for a while and was really looking forward to seeing, testing myself, may well be that just doesn't happen at all. It may well be that I do it and halfway through I'm just done, or I notice that my shin's starting to hurt again and I'm going to have to call it quits. All that kind of stuff might happen, and so be it. But at the minimum, I've hopefully learned that lesson in that training run, and now you can all hold me to account on all the things I say and did not do. Well, with that exciting note, let's get on to our main topic. I feel like I should almost apologize because you're just going to hear so much of my voice today, because Andy is not with us, as you can tell. And as a consequence, she'll be back soon, but as a consequence, you're just going to hear a lot of Zach. And, well, that's not necessarily the reason you listen to this show. So I'll not apologize because, I'm doing it anyway. And so if I were really, truly sorry, then maybe I would do something different. But instead, I will at least say this. It's temporary. So hold out and you'll get the best of the experience back soon. All right. Now, we've been talking so much about relative effort and effort perceptions lately. And that's been an interesting topic of conversation because we've been looking at a lot of different ways that different schools of thought approach the concept from various sources. If you recall, a couple episodes ago, we were talking about the different kinds of approaches to pacing and the mindsets around them, from Lydiard, who doesn't really talk about pace at all and more effort-based solely, to like the Daniel's running formula, which is based on the VDOT tables, and it's almost all pace-based. Not to say that that's the only way that Daniels recommends training, but that's a key aspect. So we've been doing that. Now, what I wanted to do here is gravitate more toward the concept of expectation within these efforts. And what we never did in our previous conversation was we never really talked about, so what do we do about that? How do we really digest the fact that expectation is going to influence efforts in some capacity? And maybe we should try to make it a less negative influence. Okay, so that's what we want to do right now. And before we get too far into it, I want to share another study that Andy encountered and really wanted to share with you. because it's a much more precise examination of this concept and is telling. So published in Canadian Science Publishing just a couple of years ago, this study looking specifically at breathing and our expectation and its influence on breathing. So the term that I'm going to use that I don't know how to pronounce exactly is dyspnea. I think that's how you say it, which is the term for like labored breathing. So if you have increased dyspnea, that's harder to breathe, more labored breathing. Or if you have decreased dyspnea, that's, anyway, less labored breathing. Okay, so that matters because that's the measurable thing we're going to look at. So the study did this. They told runners in their study that they were breathing different amounts of air, different kinds of air. So they had them like connected to things, and they would say, okay, you're either breathing just regular air from the room, we're not doing anything to it, or you're breathing reduced oxygen content. And I think the number they gave was 15% O2 in the air. And so they would just tell them, like, while you're doing this run, you're going to breathe this kind of air, right? And then in reality, no one was breathing anything different. They were all breathing the same air, and it was just the air from the room that they were in. So here's what happened. They told these runners, some of them, that they were breathing reduced oxygen content. And what do you think? Make the prediction. What do you think happened to the dyspnea or degree of labored breathing for those runners? The ones who were told that they were breathing reduced oxygen content demonstrated increased labored breathing, even though the air was the same. So it's as if it was harder to breathe, even though physiologically it was not harder to breathe. Okay, and then the ones who were told you're just breathing regular room air, no problem. Yep, it was all good. Now, they also measured leg discomfort, which is a perception thing, and found that there was no reported difference in leg discomfort. So it like clearly wasn't actually harder. They just were breathing harder because they were expecting it to be harder to breathe. That's the operative concept. And that's the conclusion that the study made, which is that expectation is a major factor here in how we think about what we're doing as runners. Even insofar as influencing how labored our breathing is. Think about something like heart rate, okay? Heart rate is a combination of two simple things. It's the physical exertion combined with the psychological perception. Your heart rate is highly influenced by the psychology of the moment. Whatever you're thinking about. Think about it like this. If you're out on a run, you know this because you've done this. If you're out on a run and let's say you listen to upbeat music, that's mostly a psychological influence, okay? That upbeat music, and yet it can increase or decrease your heart rate depending on, people respond differently to music in different ways. But you have some songs, I'm sure, that you can say, okay, if I want to really just feel excited about something, I'll listen to that song. Or if I want to just really mellow out, I'll listen to this other song. So why? Because of that. Okay, so heart rate can be influenced in that way. But it also is just as easily influenced by the thing we're thinking about. So go out on a run and think about something really just pleasant and relaxing for the run. Or go out on the same run and partway through think about your nearest upcoming race. And if you're one who especially feels nervous and excited about races in any combination, like most of us do, that's going to influence your heart rate. So the point being, this is not something you don't know, but the point being that things like breathing rates, rate of breathing, things like heart rates can be highly influenced by something as simple as expectation. Okay? Bring in then the conversation that we want to try to address here. And I'm going to refer back to in episode 158. If you didn't listen to that one, that was the one on pacing. We brought up Steve Magnus's book, The Science of Running, which I'm holding in my hands right now as I'm talking. And in that book, Steve Magnus writes about mismatch theory. And this is the relative perception, relative perceived effort concept here. And he was talking about the hazard score. So I just want to really quickly note a couple things. In looking at this concept, he writes, their goal was to look at how people regulated pace and explain the decision-making between speeding up and slowing down. So they look at different experiments tracking relative perceived effort during self-paced time trials, calculated a hazard score, and then plotted it against whether the athlete changed paces. So the hazard score then was the result of my current perception multiplied by the fraction of distance remaining. So hazard meaning how bad is this moment is kind of the way I perceive this. All right. So the mismatch theory was basically taking into account my expectation with this concept. And so you apply another layer to it. And then what it means is I feel like I should feel this way in this moment, my expected effort, but I actually feel this way. So take the hazard score again into account. If I'm feeling quite badly, but I have a very minimal amount of distance left to run, then my hazard score is low because I feel like I can endure that much distance even though I'm feeling badly. And so in that instance, then if my expectation is that I would feel badly in that moment, that it doesn't harm, the scenario at all. But where you take into account something like the expected effort and the actual sense of effort are very different. So I feel like I'm working hard, but then I look at my pace on my watch and it says I'm running slower than I think I should be at that degree of effort. Now we've added in the mismatch, which is then going to have a lot to do with performance as they were measuring it in the studies. So they were finding then that my performance was significantly declining when there was a mismatch in expectation versus actual effort. For no other reason than I thought I should have felt differently. So that if that's the concept, okay, that's my quick summary. And I was holding the book to try to make sure that I was referencing the exact. He writes it out mathematically, which I can always appreciate it. Someone like Magnus doing things like that, it's always fun. So then the key variable here is the expectation, because even if let's say that the degree of effort is challenging, if my expectation is that that's the way it's supposed to be, then the hazard score is lower. The fact that I feel like I can endure it more is incredible, because the only difference there is that I thought that that's how I should feel versus I thought I should feel better and didn't. So that's a very disconcerting reality for runners, especially for long distance races, because so many things, influence that, and so many aspects of that expectation, the amount of distance remaining, the amount of time that I'm running, what my heart rate says on my watch, what my pace says on my watch, what the people around me are doing or not doing, or my feeling or not feeling, all of those kinds of things. So the question then, that's the question I kind of want to gravitate toward for the moment, which is what data are informing this expectation? Where is this thing coming from? Because it can be things like pace and heart rate, which is probably the most common, I would guess, for most of us. But it also can be things like the context, how much I have left to run, as well as the people around me, and how long of a race it is in general. So one example of this, by the way, that I always find interesting is you think about, okay, so I feel badly, but I only have 2 miles to go, is what a marathoner would say. I feel badly, but I only have 2 miles to go, is not what a 5K runner would say, because you're only a mile into the race. And so it's like, I feel badly, I don't know if I can run like this for 2 more miles. But yet in a marathon, it's, most marathoners would say, if I can get to 2 miles to go and I'm still moving forward, I'm in a good place. So once again, the expectation influenced by that context. Then there's other layers involved. And this is kind of a shady nuance, hazy nuance, not shady, a hazy nuance, but the expectation of how I should feel. So like a marathon should feel badly in the later stages, but shouldn't feel badly in the early stages, for instance, or the middle stages. That's one consideration. But then also how I thought I would feel in those moments. So I think a marathon should feel badly in the later stages. So when it does, chances are I'm not too concerned about it. I'm just kind of taking it par for the course. But what if, so what if I thought a marathon should not feel badly until mile 22, and I'm feeling badly at 19? You see the nuance difference. So now suddenly things are changing in my head when the only difference there is that I thought it should feel good until a certain point later. So there's a consideration there. And then there's also in the situation of, as I mentioned earlier, so I thought this pace was going to be easy, but it's not easy, and now the expectation's creating a mismatch. Or I think this pace is really hard, and I'm looking at my watch and it's slower than I thought I was going. And so there's that aspect too. So when we look at all of this, the mismatch dynamic, and in concept, trying to really just say, okay, so what we're talking about is our expectations versus the reality, and how it's influencing our potential performance. In nearly every case, it can be both. And that's why we have to be careful about this, because if my expectation is that a given pace would feel challenging, and then when I'm out there, it feels easy, so I still see my pace and it feels easy, chances are that's going to contribute positively to my performance. So the mismatch is not always negative. In similar sense, if I thought that a marathon should feel hard at mile 20, and I told myself this is going to feel terrible for the last 6 miles, but then mile 20 rolls around and I don't feel so bad, now it's creating a positive mismatch experience. And so I don't want to I don't want to write off that in concept. I know a lot of runners who play mind games with themselves to try to create that positive mismatch. They tell themselves this is really going to be bad. This is going to be so bad. But then knowing that kind of in the back of their head, they're really hoping it's not. And they're kind of trying to tell themselves that enough to the point where they believe it. And then, it isn't as bad as they thought. And that's, I in terms of sports psychology, there's an important concept here where we're trying to put ourselves in the state of mind that we need to be in to be most successful. And so anticipating the hurt in a thing that inevitably does hurt is a good approach. That is a sound way to think about running, especially when I'm trying to reach peak performance. So I'm trying to push myself physically, physiologically, psychologically to my limits. So when that's the case, there is some consideration for how we navigate that in terms of trying to achieve a positive dynamic too. But I want to first note that we have these influences of expectations are more likely negative than positive for most of us in terms of the measurable dynamics in a run. And so let's talk about that for a moment, because the first thing that I would recommend as we're trying to grapple with this concept of mismatch theory and the concern of expectations not matching reality is we should try to remove the things that influence our expectations toward this mismatch. We should try to minimize them, if not get rid of them. So if the source of the mismatch is pace, for instance, if we don't ever know the pace, then that expectation is simply gone. As a consequence, we can be more reliable in terms of our reality versus expectation, just based off of the pace one. Another one is, something like heart rate. I understand the perspective of needing to look at heart rate because I want to make sure I'm not overdoing it. But at the same time, we know that heart rate is influenced by more than just the physical work that we're doing. And so where my level of concern, I'll use it that way, where my level of concern rises, my heart rate will almost always follow in nearly every situation. So as my stressors and anxiety increase, my level of concern. So then as a consequence, if I start to feel like my expectation was one thing and it's not that, and I start to feel concern about it, chances are it's going to further the negative consequence of that expectation. My heart rate's going to rise a little bit more because of the concern, the degree of stress that I'm imposing upon myself. If I never knew my heart rate and at the same time also knew that my exertion was appropriate, that wouldn't have ever happened. So in my mind, as I pursue what's the best approach to this to minimize the mismatch, I would start with thinking about what are the things that are creating the potential for these bad expectation mismatches and minimize them. Okay, so get rid of the pace stuff, get rid of the heart rate stuff. That's one side of it. Here's another one, though. In terms of my goals, is we have these time goals. And the thing with time goals in a race is that it's kind of like a coin flip. Because I'm basically saying, like, if I set a time goal ahead of time, like early in the season, that's even worse in terms of this school of thought. But even if I set a time goal the day of, here's how I think I'm feeling, here's what I want to try to run. What I'm essentially doing is I'm saying, I'm guessing, and it's an informed guess, because I have been training and preparing, but I'm guessing that if that I might be able to do this thing, and I'm putting a peg on a wall and saying that's the thing I want to shoot for. But in almost every instance, for almost every runner, that is never itself perfect. It's never entirely accurate. Do you ever actually run exactly the time goal? And yeah, probably close is a goal as well, but how close do you normally get to a time goal? Is it very, very close? The shorter the race, the closer it tends to be. But whatever the case may be, that time goal is almost always creating the overhanging expectation that tends to produce a lot of these mismatches. So I immediately start to wonder, well, what do I need the time goal for? For most of us, it's things like I want to qualify for some kind of event, like the Boston qualifiers and things like that. And that's a common need for a time goal. But at the same time, I still think that the majority of us are running and we're saying time goals simply arbitrarily. Like, I want to be able to do this thing, so this is my goal. or I did this last time, so here's my next goal, and I want to improve. Now, of course, in that instance, the goal is not actually to run a time in terms of like the core of what you want. What you want is to get better, to do better. And in theory, do better is really just the extension of the idea of doing as well as I can today. Because if I do as well as I can today and I'm in better shape than I was previously, then I will do better. Doing better is the result of doing as well as I can today when I was better prepared or better conditioned than I have been in the past. So as a result, I still encourage the perspective, that goal of I want to minimize these expectation gaps, so I just don't set goals for things that are not truly the thing that I desire to achieve on that day. I don't truly desire to achieve just a time. I want to do as well as I can. And I'm hoping that as well as I can produces a time. But the time is the result of the successful exertion. Okay, so that's a lot of Zach saying things that you've heard me say before. But there's another consideration here, which is, removing the expectations. We have a past experience bias as well. And anytime we do anything, I mean, that's probably just a normal, let's say, blanket human statement. We have a past experience bias. So if I've done this thing before and it felt a certain way, that's influencing my current thought. If it went a certain way, good, bad, and otherwise, that's influencing my current thought. And the problem is that we spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not today matches or does not match yesterday. And that is very unproductive for achieving the best possible result that today can produce. Not to say that there's no place in a time-by-time comparison for some kind of thing. But in terms of like today I want to do as well as possible, thinking about whether or not it compares to a different day in a different experience or a past experience is a highly unproductive thing to do. And so as a result, I would simply encourage just trying to orient my focus differently than that. Really, I'm trying to think about how much am I exerting right now? How do I want to feel right now? And it has nothing to do with whether or not that's been the case in the past. The paces, once again, if I don't know them, then it doesn't even matter. But if I'm paying attention to those paces, and I'm always doing this. I'm always doing this as a runner. I'm looking at the pace and I'm saying, but the other day I was doing this run and it felt like maybe I should be. And now, once again, we've created the problem. So don't look at the pace and we don't have the problem. Or just, my focus, my attention is not on what does this have to do with past experiences. My focus is on what am I trying to do right now, and trying to avoid that answer being something like time and pace. Okay, now let's talk about another layer here of these goals, because this one I find to be highly compelling and it fits right in with this. But if you're familiar with the book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution, it was like a business, but it's a Franklin Covey thing. And so it's like, self-improvement, human improvement types of stuff. And it happens to be that Steve Covey is one of the authors on it. I think it's Steve Covey. And so McChesney, Hewling, and Covey are the 3 authors. And the book itself is based around, if you're familiar with things like the WIGs, wildly important goals, or lead measures, lag measures, some of that kind of stuff. If that sounds familiar, that's what this is. That's what the 4 disciplines are, essentially. So what they write about is that when we're trying to pursue success or a goal in something, the thing that we should be measuring and the thing that we should be quantifying as benchmarks toward that success should be the inputs, otherwise called lead measures. A lead measure is the thing you do. It's controllable. I exert the thing. I make the thing happen. And if I do it, will produce the desired results, or at least should. Some of these things are not terribly, linear. But in this case, as a runner, my lead measures are, at their core, my lead measure fundamentally is my exertion. My degree of effort is my lead measure, because that's the one thing that I fully control as a runner, is how hard am I running. Not to say that you can always run harder, because there's a time where you're running and it's like, I've got nothing left. But I still control the amount of exertion I'm giving. I don't feel capable of giving certain amounts more. So in that case, as a runner, if I exert myself and orient my thinking around that as my lead measure, that gives me then a clear, controllable benchmark that I can track accordingly. So I'm giving certain degrees of effort at certain times, whether it's in a race or training, and I can create then a success metric based off of a clear, measurable lead measure that I control. And so that's where they call it keeping score. We want to create a visible scoreboard. In this sense, this is just individual. So like training logs and things like that. We have the training logs well, I don't know when that all started for runners. The training log thing. Lydiard used to write about it back in the 50s, so it's been around a long time. And the training log for most runners is how good did I do, right? How fast did I run? So I'm looking at my paces, or how much did I run? I'm looking at my distances, and I'm looking at, did I hit my 100 miles last week? That was always that thing of like, if you can run 100 miles a week, you're super elite, and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's what the training log has become, but that's not what the training log should be if we're taking into account the 4 disciplines of execution wisdom. The training log should be, how much did I exert myself, and for how long? That's going to matter, because that's a piece of this key puzzle, which we'll actually talk about a little bit more in the World of Running segment. But the lead measure is the thing that I should be tracking, and that's what I should be thinking about as I'm creating my running logs, as I'm reflecting on my training and my progress, because those are the things that are going to produce ultimately the desired success. Contrary to, if I may say so, contemporary thinking, which is that, if I can run certain paces, then I get faster, or if I can run, if I can run this fast, I can produce this kind of marathon result. But my goal is not to run that time in training. My goal is to be as fast as possible in racing. And in order to do that, I need to be as fit as possible. And to get as fit as possible, I need to do the thing in training that makes me more fit, which has everything to do with how I am exerting myself and almost nothing to do with how fast I'm running. Okay. So then the third layer here, that's these things obviously all interweave, and that's kind of the reason why I'm doing this. So if my thinking here is I can combat the expectation bias that happens, or the mismatch that happens with these things, then ultimately what it really comes back to is this is hard to do in a race. And I get it. So I'm talking with many of our runners about this as we're preparing for races, and it's, I want you to try to run by effort is one thing we talk about sometimes. Not everyone will do it, but if we talk about that, one of the questions comes up: how do I know? One, how do I know that I'm exerting the right amount of effort for this, event that I'm doing? And two, how do I know how much more effort I have that I can utilize? That is a really important reflection and question, because if I haven't really trained in such a way that I've conditioned that intuition, then chances are likely I'm going to get it wrong, and potentially catastrophically. And I don't want that for anyone. So what this all begins with is I train in such a way to teach myself to recognize degrees of effort and sustainability of effort. How long can I run for this effort at this degree of comfortability? And so we train based on exertion then, not only because it's the most effective and efficient way to build fitness, giving the right amount of effort for the day based off how I'm feeling. Not only is that the best way to train to gain fitness, but it's also conditioning myself to be able to understand my efforts so that when it comes time to race, I can have a clear sense of the actual effort. I can avoid the mismatch in expectations because I am no longer producing in myself this need for an objective data measure that may or may not be a reflection of reality. And so I can avoid the mismatch entirely not entirely. I don't know if that's possible, but I can avoid it and minimize it substantially. And then one final note, it's important to be reflective and honest with ourselves about, how much was I exerting there? How much longer could I run at that effort? Can I execute that effort for a given distance, something that I'm training for? And the reason why I say it's important to be reflective and honest is because it's very, very easy to tell myself that I can do a thing when the data are not proving it out. And so, again, I'm not trying to use the data for these things. But what ends up happening is I can convince myself of both sides of that argument really easily. And so the honest reflection is, I have to start to understand how I'm feeling based off of the amount that I'm exerting. And when I can do that better and consistently, I'm much more able to have an honest reflection on what is the potential for the race. And when I get to race day, all I have to do then is exert the effort that I know I can for the amount of time that I know I can handle it to the best of my abilities. And what it ultimately comes down to is there will always be still instances where it doesn't work out for many, many reasons. Certainly notwithstanding things like, unexpected shin pain like I had on that training run, right? Let's say that happens in a race, of course that can be detrimental, can be catastrophic. And so like that kind of stuff can happen regardless of how well I execute. But at its core, if I want to combat the mismatch The best way to approach that is to create in myself the intuition to not need the data, and as a result, then to be able to race in that way, not just in training. Well, now that I have solved the problem of mismatch theory, I don't know if that's the case. He doesn't even actually articulate it as a problem. But now that we've gotten really deep into it, we've got some really interesting thoughts and reflections to help kind of carry the conversation into some present scenarios too, up next in the world of running. All right, quick shout out before we begin to Christy running what is this race distance actually? It's like 9.2 kilometers. She ran around Mackinac Island in a race, and those of you who are not listening from Michigan area, not familiar with Mackinac Island, it's like an 8-mile road around this island, beautiful island. Anyway, very cool race. Great work, Christy. Nice job stringing together what was an impressive season with a lot going on there. Excellent job. Now let's talk about, first on our list here, we were alluding to some of these things just a little bit in the main topic. And so there's an article here published in Outside Magazine by Alex Hutchinson. Hutchinson writes a lot about sciencey running stuff, and so I always appreciate that. And in this particular article, we've linked to it on the website, so if you want to find it there to read more, there's 2 reasons why you want to do that, and don't just take my word for it. One is because he links to 2 different studies that I'm going to just briefly mention here, and he kind of dissects them a bit more in the articles. And so this one article is kind of like a thread of a few other thoughts that he's been writing about for a while. So as a consequence, you might want to follow up and read the article in more length so you can actually get the full extent of what he was doing here. So he was talking about race pace prediction stuff for marathoners. And in particular, an interesting one that came across his attention after he wrote about it recently in a very heavy data focused one, which is not what he was covering here. Then he found this other example that was very different than the data focused one. So here's what they did. This was some Japanese researchers looking at marathoners and trying to find trends in training and marathon performance. So if you're doing these things in training, you're more likely to see this kind of result in performance, right? Not to say that we don't already know some of these things, but how clearly and closely can we predict the potential of performance based off of what you're doing in training? Trying to just get closer or more precise. So what they did is they did kind of 2 layers of it. The first thing is they subgrouped runners. This is what made this study particularly interesting. They subgrouped runners by things like frequency. So all of these runners are running 7 days a week, or 5 to 7, I think was the number for the highest amount. All of them are running 5 to 7 days a week. And so then the question is, what were they doing differently in the 5 to 7, and did it have an impact on performance? So the ones who did certain things had a better chance of performance at a higher level than the ones who didn't. And what they found is that in frequency, as you might guess, higher volume predicted better performance. So the ones who are running 7 days a week, but they ran like just more in each of those runs, they had a better chance of success. So as a marathon, that's not surprising. We are not finding that surprising at all. But then they flipped it and they said, okay, let's keep consistent overall volume, like monthly volume. Apparently, I didn't even know this, but apparently Japanese runners usually track volume by months, not by weeks. I say usually. That's a more common, and certainly you don't see that a lot. Other common things are weekly. And so they're tracking monthly volume, and they're saying basically, okay, so everyone in this subgroup is running the same volume in a given month. And then what are they doing differently with like frequency, and when do they run those runs? How much do they run at once for a given run, right? And here's what was fascinating is they did not find it to be incredibly predictable of performance, of successful performance in the variations of how much they would train within the same volume. So if we're all running the same amount per week, if we do it a little differently, like I run shorter runs more frequently, you run longer runs less frequently, it seems to be largely consistent in terms of performance results, according to their studies, which I found to be really fascinating. Now, let's look at it like this. Okay, so let's say you run 7 hours in a week. That's your weekly volume, and you do 2 3.5-hour runs, and that's your whole week, right? And then someone else runs 7 1-hour runs across the week. According to their information in the study, there was a chance that there wasn't much of a statistical difference in potential results for those 2 scenarios. Okay, so that's really curious. It's once again, I think about it further as they're describing it, and I'm thinking that's actually not terribly surprising, in large part because the adaptations you achieve in the 3.5 hour run, if you can adapt to it. So if this is someone who's doing things like that regularly, they're going to be different than the adaptations you achieve in 7 1-hour runs, right? And so in theory, the 3.5 hour run gives you a higher density of potential training adaptations, once again, if you can adapt to it. Now, this is the extreme example. So in most instances, they're not taking an extreme example. They're actually saying it's more like, someone might run a few short runs during the week and then a bigger long run on the weekend and maybe a second smaller long run. So they do longer stuff Saturday, Sunday. The Weekend Warrior, for instance, they actually, Hutchinson referenced the term in his article. The Weekend Warrior is one approach here. And as they do that, we find quite clearly that it can be successful compared against a more even split. Now, here's the one exception, and this is the most important part that I find in all of this examination. So the most important exception here is that they found consistently that those who still had variability, so you're just not running the same thing every day, but you have some runs longer, some runs shorter, that was more likely in every instance to be a predictor of success. And that does not surprise us in the least. So what do we learn from something like that? We don't necessarily learn a lot that we didn't already know, except for it's kind of like validating certain schools of thought. It's also helping to substantiate, if I sit there and say, okay, I don't have a ton of time during the week. I'm not one of those runners who can do, 2-hour runs a couple of days a week throughout the week. But I can manage an hour most days, and then I can get out there and do some decent long runs on the weekend. That's still going to give me a much better chance of success than, if I just kind of didn't try to make the effort. So obviously, we should say obviously there because it is obvious, but at the same time, it sometimes discourages people to think, well, I can't be out there every single day as long as someone else might be, but I can still achieve great results in my experience. So that's one consideration. But then the other side of what Hutchinson was writing about was a much more scientific approach where they looked at like huge and heaps of Strava data and all the stuff that comes with it. And what they were looking at was critical speed. And so if your critical speed is basically like the point at which failure occurs, right beyond it is when failure occurs, then they were finding that marathoners seem to be able to sustain a percent of critical speed fairly consistently. And it was a very curious study. So that might be one that I want to look at in more depth another time. And if you want to read more about it yourself, I'm linking to it in our article on AtoZrunning.com. Okay, let's look at the Valencia half marathon for a moment. So in Valencia, which is like where everyone goes to run fast half marathons in the world these days, as published by World Athletics, the men's race was highly exciting, and for a couple of different reasons, not just at the front of the race. So Kibiwott Kandi of Kenya won the race in 58:10 for a half marathon. He, if you were not aware, broke the world record 2 years ago and still holds the second all-time fastest half marathon time by a second, I think it is. His world record and then Jacob Kiplimo's world record after the fact are very, very close together. So he's clearly got, he's got the hackles and he's rolling. So Kandi runs 58:10, breaks the field apart at somewhere in the midst of 10K to 15K. And here's what he did. They go through 10K in 27:50 something, 51, I think. So think about that. For 10K, it's under 28 minutes. And then his next 5K, from 10K to 15K, his next 5K was 13:26. So he dropped like 30 seconds on that next 5K, which is the hardest moment in the half marathon race too. That third quarter is brutal. So what an amazing performance by Kandi, and not to be outdone, in second place, we had a national record performance too. So it was like fast people running fast. Yamif Kejelcha of Ethiopia broke the Ethiopian national record to finish second at 58:32. And it should be noted that that's the Ethiopian national record. He is number 12 all time, right? So Ethiopia's national record is only number 12 all time. That tells you something about how fast the all-time half marathon list is. For that to be the case, because Yamif Kejelcha's broken like world record stuff and indoor track, and so he's one of the best ever. Now that being the case, of those in front of Yamif Kejelcha, 9 of them 10 of them, 11, 12, 9 or 10 of them are Kenyan. So like the Kenyans have the half marathon just like in a stranglehold. They're just dominating that performance list, and it's really something to see. So Candy won the race. Kejelcha was in second. And then a little ways back in the men's race, we had a duel for a national record between two Canadians. Ben Flanagan and Cam Levins were, they finished within 5 seconds of each other. And the national record, Canadian national record, went to Ben Flanagan in a time of 61 minutes flat. Cam Levins 5 seconds behind. So you look at that and you think, wow, that's what an incredible thing. They're both racing for the national record right there with each other. But what it ended up being, how it broke down, is even more interesting. Ben Flanagan was 20 seconds behind Levins in the first at 5K. 20 seconds behind at 5K. And at 10K, he was, I think, still 20 seconds behind because he ran an even next 5K split and Cam Levins slowed a bit. And so what ended up happening was from 10K on, Ben Flanagan made up 25 seconds. It took 20 seconds to catch him and 5 more seconds to pass him. But he hadn't yet passed him until 20K. So you break this down a little bit and say, okay, half marathon's 21K, basically. Flanagan catches Cam Levins finally with 1K to go and only puts about 5 seconds on him. So they're still tight from that point on, too. And it's just like, it's amazing to see that splits break down. Flanagan just on the charge through the whole race. What an impressive performance. On the women's side, there was a debut victory, which is always exciting. And this one, Germany's Constanze Klosterhoffen. And if you're familiar with on the track, she's been winning medals in the World Championships at like 1,500 and 3,000 meter distances. And so, showing up, and 5,000, 10,000, she's been running great too. But she shows up on the roads, her first half marathon, wins the Valencia half against world-class talent, only missing the German national record by 23 seconds, as it were, in 105.41. Impressive performances in Valencia. All right, last note here. This one's just a fascinating article. Once again, from Outside Magazine, this one by Becky Wade. She writes about running gels, and we're all very familiar with the need to have the gels that work well for us, so don't have digestive issues, gastrointestinal problems. And so Wade writes about how we could consider creating our own running gels. Just blend it up, make it yourself. Good advice here. Pretty straightforward stuff, and so we can always appreciate, the practicality of something like this. Best way to get a gel that fits the need, of course, is to make it yourself, so you can put the exact ingredients in it that you need. She was writing about the importance of sugar versus fat protein types of elements in there, and then like sources of sugar and types of sugar. So we already know, because you've been listening to us, and we've been reading people who write smart things about these things, that it's important to have multiple sources of nutrients in your running nutrition, because your body can only absorb so much at one time of a certain source or a certain type. So for example, sugars, you only have so many ways you can absorb fructose, and so if you have a lot of fructose and nothing else, you don't actually absorb all of it, and so as a consequence, it's not helping you as much as it should. So we need multiple sources of sugars, for example, and Wade writes about that, and specifically noting that fructose, which tends to come from fruit, so you're gonna blend in something like a banana, you're gonna get your fructose there. But then sucralose is another one that tends to come from like the starchy carbohydrate stuff, and so you might have like grains or rices or something that you'd blend up into there. If you're familiar with Gen-UCAN, that's a starch-based gel. It's got a slower release mechanism because starches are more complex carbohydrates. It takes longer to break them down, so they last longer, and as a consequence, you have less of that like spike and trough. So thinking about that, well, I could just create my own like version of Gen-UCAN with a little bit more, because Gen-UCAN is very limited. It's only like one thing. And so I could create a more dynamic version of Gen-UCAN. That's cool. Also, though, Wade notes in the article that we should consider things like what else do we need to add? Is there enough sodium naturally in the things I put in there? If not, I should probably add some more. It's not very hard to just put table salt into something like this. Similarly, it's not that hard to just add like, bleached white sugar, not to suggest that you should be throwing in tons of extra sugar, because if you're putting in sugary foods, then you're getting it naturally. But if I needed more of some of that kind of stuff, there's ways of doing that. Especially from our perspective, the need for certain types of electrolytes and making sure you have enough of them, sodium, potassium, and things, is key, because the hydration element of all of this has a lot to do with the electrolytes that are not sugars, and the things that are the ingredients that are not sugars. Now, there's another consideration that I always think about with these types of things. Gels are the most valuable to us when they have dynamic sources of nutrients, as we mentioned. But what tends to be hard to find naturally are some of those other micronutrients. Things like the vitamins, some of them are more common in some sources than others, but I want to avoid vegetables, which have a lot of those other types of vitamins and minerals. I want to avoid them because they're too high in fiber usually, and fiber is going to almost always cause problems for runners in races. So I have to think about that. What's the kind of thing I can take on that has good sources? Strawberries have vitamin C, right? And plenty of sugars. But strawberries have too much fructose. And so if I put in too many strawberries, then that's causing me problems. So I have to think about, if I'm going to make something like this myself, there's a reason why these things started to become synthetic, in part because it's cheaper in most instances to produce, but also because it's easier to get a wider variety of certain types of nutrients when they're synthetic, and I'm not trying to just blend in a bunch of spinach leaves, for instance. So I have to think about that. If I'm going to create my own, I need to make sure that I can get the types of ingredients that I need, and not just like, I look at what's in things. I'm not going to just put a banana and some orange and some apple and call it good. End up with some nasty gastrointestinal problems. Maybe I'll blend in some rice powder and So I have to be deliberate about that, because a lot of times, even though these things can be all natural, and that itself is of great value, the absorption quality tends to be higher, for instance, but at the same time, they can also cause more problems than they solve if I'm doing the wrong thing with them too. So that's my take, and appreciate, as we're looking through, our content today was largely focused around some things we're trying to do that are practical and helpful to you, but we're going to get even more practical when we answer your questions next week. And if you have questions unsubmitted at this time that are on your mind and you want to share them, go to AtoZrunning.com/question. Submit it. We may not be able to fit you in next week, but if, depending on the question, and if we can answer it quickly enough, we can add it to the queue. And if we can't next week, we will again the next time around. So certainly share those thoughts with us. Make sure that you head to the AtoZrunning shop so you can get your sweet gear before it runs out. Sizes are limited. We've got enough of everything at the moment that if you head there soon, you'll get something. So check it out. Shipping all over the place. No worries there. And we'll definitely look forward to the next time around. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again soon.